If you think divorce is just a modern debate, the words of Jesus pull you thousands of years back into a much deeper social crisis that was already tearing people apart. What he speaks about is not random, and it is not detached from real human pain. It is a response to a system where relationships, especially marriage, had started to break down under misuse, convenience, and power. Jesus reaches back to what was known as the certificate of divorce, a practice that had become deeply tied to cultural and religious life among God's people. On the surface, it looked like legal permission, but in reality, it often became a tool that made separation easy and consequences one-sided. The conversation is not just about law, it is about how that law was being used and abused in everyday life. At the center of Jesus' concern is not simply the idea of divorce itself, but the way divorce was being handled lightly and irresponsibly. In many cases, men were treating it like a casual option rather than a serious covenant decision. And behind that behavior was something even more troubling. Women were being treated less like human beings and more like possessions that could be discarded when inconvenient. So when Jesus speaks in Matthew 5:31-32, his focus is not a blanket rejection of every situation involving divorce. Instead, he is directly confronting a pattern of careless separation and injustice. His words carry a strong protective weight, especially toward women who are often left vulnerable, displaced, and socially exposed after being dismissed without real cause. To understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to step into the world of the Pharisees. They were a highly respected religious group in Jewish society, known for strict religious observance and influence over public interpretation of the law. But even within their ranks, there was intense disagreement about marriage, divorce, and what was actually allowed under God's law. This disagreement was shaped largely by two influential schools of thought. One was associated with Shammai, who held a more conservative interpretation of marriage. In his view, divorce should only happen in cases of serious marital unfaithfulness, meaning the covenant should remain protected and not easily broken. On the other side was the teaching associated with Hillel, which had a much more permissive approach. Under this interpretation, a man could essentially end a marriage for almost any reason. What started as disagreement in theology quickly turned into something far more practical and far more damaging for everyday people. Over time, this loosened view of divorce led to extreme and even shocking examples in society. Historical discussions suggest situations where trivial issues became grounds for separation. Something as minor as a burned meal, or dissatisfaction with appearance, or simple loss of attraction could be used as justification to end a marriage. The result was instability that disproportionately harmed women. To this environment of debate and confusion, the Pharisees approached Jesus with a question that is meant to test him. In Matthew 19, they ask whether it is lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason. It's not a neutral question. It is a trap shaped by ongoing arguments and cultural tension. But instead of stepping into their categories, Jesus redirects the entire conversation. His response begins with a challenge that cuts deeper than expected. Haven't you read? That question alone shifts the focus from opinion culture and debate back to something far more foundational, what has actually been written and understood from the beginning. And in that moment, Jesus is not just answering a question about divorce. He is confronting a larger issue that still exists today, the tendency to shape beliefs around culture rather than grounding them in what has already been revealed. The real tension is not only about marriage laws, but about whether people are actually formed by truth or simply carried by popular understanding. This is where the conversation begins to move from external rules into something more personal and challenging, as Jesus starts to expose the gap between what people think they know and what has actually been written. And that shift sets the foundation for everything he is about to say next. Jesus' response does not stay in abstract debate for long. He immediately pulls the conversation back to something more grounded, something that existed long before the arguments of religious leaders or the shifting opinions of culture. When he says, "Haven't you read?" he is not simply correcting ignorance. He is exposing how easily people can become familiar with religion but disconnected from what it actually says. There's a sharp edge to that question because it challenges confidence built on assumption rather than understanding. Many people in the discussion thought they were defending truth, but Jesus is showing that they may actually be defending cultural habits dressed up as religious permission. That distinction matters because when belief is shaped by culture instead of truth, it always produces confusion when life becomes difficult. This is where Jesus begins to reframe marriage itself. He does not start with divorce rules. He starts at the beginning, pointing them back to the original design. Takes them away from legal debates and brings them to creation itself, where the foundation of human relationships was first established. In that foundation, he reminds them that the Creator made humanity male and female. This is not presented as a cultural idea or social development, but as intentional design. The point he is making is that marriage is not something that evolves based on convenience or preference. It is something rooted in how humanity itself was structured from the start. Then Jesus quotes the principle that a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is not just poetic language. It is a declaration of unity that changes how separation should be understood. Once two lives are joined at that level, the idea of casually undoing it becomes much more serious than people were treating it. He then draws a conclusion that would have cut through many assumptions in that room. If two become one, then they are no longer two separate entities operating independently. That union is not easily reversed without deep consequence. And because of that, Jesus adds a boundary that directly challenges the culture of easy divorce. What God has joined together, let no man separate. That statement is not just about personal relationships, it is about authority. It places the origin of marriage in God's hands, not human systems. So when humans begin separating what God has joined for trivial reasons, they are not simply making personal decisions, they are interfering with something sacred in its origin. At this point, the conversation takes another turn. The Pharisees push further, asking why Moses allowed divorce in the first place if this is the original design. They are trying to create tension between Jesus' teaching and the law they already know. In their mind, if Moses permitted it, then it must be legitimate. But Jesus does not accept that framing. Instead, he clarifies the reason behind that allowance. Moses permitted divorce not because it reflected God's ideal, but because of human hardness. It was a concession, not a celebration. It was a regulatory response to a broken condition, not a reflection of perfect design. This is a crucial shift in understanding. Jesus is separating permission from intention. Just because something is allowed in a damaged system does not mean it represents the heart of God. In fact, he is showing that some laws exist not because things are right, but because people are not. Then Jesus brings the argument back into alignment. From the beginning, it was not meant to be this way. That phrase reestablishes the original standard and exposes how far human practice had drifted from divine intention. What was designed for unity had been reduced to convenience. He then addresses the seriousness of illegitimate separation. In cases where divorce is not aligned with that deeper covenant reality, the consequences are not just emotional or social, but moral. The language he uses makes it clear that treating covenant lightly produces spiritual disorder, not just relational change. At the same time, Jesus is not denying that brokenness exists. He is not pretending that every relationship can be preserved at any cost. Instead, he is drawing a line between situations that are treated casually and situations that involve real violation of covenant trust. That distinction becomes central to understanding the seriousness of his teaching. The reaction from the disciples shows how heavy this teaching feels in practice. They respond by saying that if this is the standard, then it might be better not to marry at all. That response reveals how deeply the idea of permanence challenges human comfort. It is easier to avoid commitment altogether than to accept responsibility within it, but Jesus does not soften the standard. Instead, he acknowledges that not everyone can accept this teaching, only those who are able to receive it. That statement shows that he is not speaking to crowds in general opinion, but to people willing to be shaped by a higher understanding of commitment, responsibility, and purpose. He also introduces the idea that singleness itself can carry purpose. Not every life is defined by marriage, and not every calling requires it. Some are called to remain single for reasons tied to purpose, focus, or assignment. This broadens the conversation beyond pressure and cultural expectation. At this stage, Jesus is not just answering a question about divorce. He is reconstructing how people think about relationships entirely. He is moving them away from convenience-based thinking and toward covenant-based understanding. And that shift sets the stage for how seriously he expects human relationships to be treated moving forward. This is where the tension begins to settle into something deeper. What started as a legal question has now become a question about the condition of the human heart, the meaning of commitment, and the difference between what culture permits and what God actually intended from the beginning. The conversation continues to press deeper into the gap between what people were practicing and what God originally intended. At this point, Jesus is no longer just responding to legal questions or cultural debates. He is exposing the condition of the human heart behind those questions. Because the real issue was never only about divorce laws, but about how easily people justify breaking covenant when it becomes inconvenient. When Jesus brings the discussion back to the beginning again, he is not repeating himself by accident. He is reinforcing a pattern. Truth does not shift with culture, it returns to origin. And origin matters because it reveals intention. In his framing, marriage was never designed as a flexible arrangement that bends under pressure, but as a binding unity that reflects something deeper than preference or emotion. This is where the weight of his statement becomes clearer. The problem is not that people were confused about the law. The problem is that they were using the law to excuse what their hearts already wanted to do. And once desire leads interpretation, truth slowly gets reshaped into permission instead of conviction. That is why Jesus points out that Moses' allowance for divorce was never the ideal. It was a response to hardness of heart. In other words, it was not a reflection of divine desire, but a containment of human brokenness. This distinction matters because it separates what God permits in a fallen world from what God actually desires in a restored one. At this point, the conversation shifts into something even more uncomfortable. Jesus explains that when divorce is handled outside of legitimate covenant violation, it creates consequences that extend beyond paperwork or social status. It distorts the original unity in God's eyes. That is why the seriousness of his words cannot be reduced to simple legal categories. The discussion also highlights how easily systems can be used to hide injustice. What looked like a legal certificate was often used to justify emotional harm and social abandonment. Women in particular were left exposed because once dismissed, they carried the weight of survival without the protection that marriage once provided in that society. Jesus is confronting that imbalance directly. His teaching is not abstract theology. It is a correction of how power was being exercised within relationships. And by doing so, he is recentering dignity, accountability, and responsibility within the covenant of marriage. When the Pharisees push the question further, asking why Moses allowed such a practice at all, they are trying to anchor their argument in authority. But Jesus dismantles that logic by separating divine intention from human concession. Just because something exists in a legal framework does not mean it reflects the heart of God. He explains that Moses permitted divorce because of human hardness. That phrase carries a deeper meaning than simple stubbornness. It refers to a condition where the heart becomes resistant to truth, resistant to correction, and resistant to covenant faithfulness. In that state, rules are introduced not to approve behavior, but to manage damage. This is where Jesus redefines how people should read Scripture. Law is not always endorsement. Sometimes it is containment, sometimes it is regulation of brokenness, not celebration of behavior, and misunderstanding that difference leads people to assume that permission equals approval. As he brings the discussion back again to the beginning, Jesus reinforces a consistent principle. Original design always carries authority over later compromise. What was established at creation defines the standard, not what was later tolerated because of human failure. That is why he emphasizes that a man leaves his father and mother and becomes united with his wife, forming one flesh. This unity is not symbolic in a weak sense, it is foundational. It describes a level of relational binding that should not be approached casually or dismantled lightly. From that foundation, Jesus makes the statement that what God has joined, no human authority should separate. The weight of that declaration is not just moral, it is theological. It places marriage within divine action, meaning it is not merely a contract between two individuals, but something established under God's involvement. This is also where misunderstanding often begins. People tend to view marriage as something they control fully, but Jesus is reframing it as something they enter into under divine witness. And anything that involves God's joining carries a seriousness that cannot be reduced to convenience. When the disciples react with concern, saying it might be better not to marry at all, it reveals how challenging this standard feels when taken seriously. Human instinct often prefers flexibility over permanence, because permanence demands endurance, patience, and self-denial. But Jesus does not lower the standard to make it easier. Instead, he acknowledges that not everyone can accept this teaching. That statement shows that commitment at this level is not just social expectation, but spiritual capacity. It requires maturity, understanding, and willingness to live under a higher calling. He also introduces the reality that singleness is not a failure state. It can be a calling, a form of focus, or a purposeful life path. This broadens the conversation beyond pressure and removes the assumption that every life must follow the same relational structure. At this point, the teaching is no longer just about marriage and divorce. It is about how people interpret truth, how they handle covenant, and how they respond when God's standard challenges cultural ease. And that tension continues to expose whether people are willing to align with origin or remain attached to convenience. As the teaching continues, the tension shifts from theory into real-life consequences, and Jesus begins to expose how his words would actually function in a broken world. What he has been building toward is not just a definition of marriage, but a correction of how people treat covenant when life becomes difficult and emotions start to override commitment. At this point, the discussion is no longer only about what is allowed, but about what is right in the eyes of God versus what is commonly practiced in human systems. Jesus is drawing a clear line between cultural tolerance and divine standard, and that line forces people to rethink not just divorce, but the entire way they approach relationships. He begins to clarify that many of the divorces being justified in that society were not rooted in covenant failure, but in convenience, frustration, or dissatisfaction. These were not cases of deep violation, but rather situations where people were treating marriage as something disposable. And that is exactly what he is confronting. The problem, as Jesus presents it, is that when marriage becomes conditional on personal comfort, it loses its covenant meaning. Once that shift happens, the relationship is no longer anchored in commitment, but in preference. And preference changes easily, which is why so many unions were being broken for trivial reasons. In this context, Jesus is not ignoring the reality of broken relationships. Instead, he is distinguishing between what is truly destructive to covenant and what is simply inconvenient. That distinction is important because it prevents sacred commitments from being discarded over temporary dissatisfaction. As he continues, he addresses the idea that some separations, when illegitimate, still carry spiritual weight even if they appear legal on paper. In other words, human systems may recognize a divorce as complete, but that does not automatically mean it aligns with God's standard. This creates a tension between earthly approval and divine perspective. That is why his teaching feels so strong to those listening. It challenges the assumption that legality always equals righteousness. Jesus is essentially saying that something can be permitted by society and still be misaligned with God's intention. This is where the seriousness of covenant becomes more visible. Marriage is not just a private agreement between two people, but a bond that carries spiritual responsibility. Because of that, it cannot be treated lightly without consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. When Jesus speaks about remarriage in this context, he is not attacking people who have already experienced brokenness. He is addressing the root issue that led to unnecessary separation in the first place. The concern is not condemnation, but distortion of covenant through careless decision-making. In that sense, his words are aimed at preventing harm rather than assigning lifelong shame. He is trying to stop a cycle where relationships are entered quickly, broken quickly, and then repeated without reflection or accountability. The reaction to his teaching shows how heavy this standard feels. The disciples begin to realize that if marriage is this serious and permanent, then entering it requires a level of responsibility that should not be taken lightly. Their response reflects how deeply human thinking is shaped by convenience rather than covenant. But Jesus does not soften the principle to match human hesitation. Instead, he acknowledges that this teaching is not easy for everyone to accept. Some people will struggle with it because it demands maturity, discipline, and a willingness to live beyond emotional impulse. He also expands the understanding of singleness again, showing that life does not lose meaning outside of marriage. In fact, singleness can carry purpose when it is lived with intention. This removes the idea that worth or fulfillment is dependent on marital status. From here, the teaching becomes less about rules and more about formation. Jesus is shaping a mindset where relationships are viewed through responsibility, not convenience. And that shift challenges a culture that often prioritizes personal satisfaction over long-term faithfulness. As the passage continues to unfold, the central theme becomes clearer. God's standard is not designed to trap people, but to protect them from the damage that comes when covenant is treated casually. What looks restrictive on the surface is actually meant to preserve dignity, stability, and justice within relationships. And in that way, Jesus is not lowering expectations to make life easier. He is raising understanding so that people can see the weight and value of what they are participating in when they enter marriage. This sets up the final layer of his teaching, where he will move from explanation into application, showing how these principles should shape real decisions, real relationships, and real life conduct moving forward. As the teaching reaches its conclusion, Jesus brings everything back from theological explanation into real life application. The conversation has moved through culture, law, human hardness, and original design, and now it lands on how believers are actually meant to live in response to all of it. This is where the weight of his message becomes personal, because it is no longer about interpretation alone, but about daily practice. He begins by making it clear that marriage is not something to be treated casually or temporarily, as if it can be entered and exited based on emotion or circumstance. Instead, it is a covenant that carries responsibility before God and before people. That means it requires seriousness, patience, and a long-term mindset that resists the pressure of culture's convenience-based thinking. In practical terms, Jesus is confronting the mindset that treats relationships like something disposable. When frustration rises, when differences appear, or when emotions shift, the temptation is often to escape rather than endure. But his teaching directly challenges that reflex and calls for a different response, one rooted in commitment rather than impulse. He also makes clear that when separation happens outside of legitimate covenant violation, it creates spiritual disorder. Not because God is looking to condemn people harshly, but because covenant is designed to reflect unity. When unity is broken carelessly, it distorts that reflection and produces consequences that are deeper than what people often consider in the moment of decision. At the same time, Jesus does not ignore reality. He acknowledges that some situations involve genuine brokenness where reconciliation may not be possible. But even then, the underlying principle, covenant should never be treated lightly, and separation should never be the first response to difficulty. It is always meant to be approached with gravity, discernment, and responsibility. This is why he frames divorce not as a default option, but as something that should only be considered under serious and legitimate circumstances. The goal is not to trap people in unhealthy situations, but to prevent unnecessary destruction of what was meant to be a lifelong union. From this perspective, Jesus is also correcting how people think about blame and justification. He is showing that many justifications used in his time were rooted in selfishness rather than righteousness. People were often using legal permission as a cover for personal dissatisfaction, and he is calling that out directly. As he closes the teaching, he shifts the focus toward how believers should conduct themselves differently from the surrounding culture. The world may operate on convenience, but those who follow him are called to a higher standard of faithfulness, integrity, and love within marriage. This includes a mindset of investment rather than replacement. Instead of treating marriage as something to discard when it becomes difficult, he calls for endurance, growth, and intentional effort to strengthen what has been joined together. That means working through conflict, seeking wisdom, and refusing to allow selfishness to dictate decisions. He also emphasizes that honor should define how relationships are handled. Marriage is not just a personal arrangement, but something that should be respected, protected, and valued by all who understand its sacred nature. That includes not only those who are married, but also those who are single, separated, divorced, or remarried. The broader implication is that the community of believers is responsible for upholding a culture that honors covenant. It is not just an individual matter, but a collective standard that shapes how relationships are viewed, discussed, and protected. As the message closes, the emphasis falls on transformation rather than condemnation. Jesus is not speaking to shame people for past failures, but to realign understanding so that future decisions are made with wisdom and reverence. Where there has been hurt, he points toward healing. Where there has been confusion, he brings clarity. Where there has been casualness, he restores seriousness. Ultimately, his teaching draws everything back to one central idea. Marriage is sacred because it reflects something God has joined. And because of that, it deserves to be treated with a level of honor that rises above cultural pressure and personal impulse. The final call is not just to understand the teaching, but to live differently because of it, to move away from convenience-driven relationships and toward covenant faithfulness. To value people, protect unity, and reflect the seriousness of what God has established, and in doing so, to bring a higher standard of love, responsibility, and integrity into everyday life.